Hello everyone, it's great to be here at Nullcon. I'm here to talk about a vulnerability that breaks process isolation on macOS. But don't worry, this talk is not super technical. It's about a very simple vulnerability that came from a fundamental mistake Apple made. But I think it should be interesting. Before we get started, let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Koh and I'm a cybersecurity researcher at a place called FFRS Security, which is a Japanese security company connecting a wide range of security research. My current focus is on Apple product security, especially macOS. I've previously given talks at Black Hat and Cold Brew, but this is my first time attending Nullcon, so I'm really excited to be here. Let's kick things off with the exploit code of today's talk. Yeah, that's it. Just one-line proof of concept. But don't let its simplicity fool you. This exploit code is actually quite powerful. It allows you to dump the login keychain, bypassing TCP, privacy protection, and even decrypt iOS apps on macOS. So the real question is, why does this work and how? That's exactly what I'll be explaining today. Here's a quick overview of today's talk. First, I'll give you a background information to make sure we are on the same page. Then I'll explain how that one-line POC works, especially how it can dump keychain, bypass TCP, and decrypt iOS apps. After that, I'll share some ideas for finding similar bugs and detecting exploitation attempts. Finally, I'll wrap things up with a conclusion and key takeaways. So let's start with a brief history of macOS. For those who may not be familiar, macOS is a descendant of NextStep, an operating system developed by the company named Next, founded by Steve Jobs. NextStep itself was based on a Mac FreeBSD, so macOS is also a Unix-based operating system. This figure shows the evolution of Unix and Unix-like operating systems. As you can see here, macOS is a direct descendant of NextStep, and it's partly based on FreeBSD 3. However, its security model is quite different from that of traditional Unix operating systems. One major difference is a feature called System Integrity Protection, or SIP, also known as rootless. SIP was introduced in OS X El Capitan. It's designed to restrict certain dangerous operations such as modifying system files, loading untrusted kernel extensions, and debugging the processes. Even processes running as root are not allowed to do these dangerous operations. If you're Windows users, think of it like being unable to get a process handled even with admin rights. This means that, for example, third-party antivirus software cannot inspect the memory of other process. Even with root privileges. The fact that SIP restricts control over other processes is the main focus of this talk. Technically speaking, SIP is a controlled binary envelope variable called CSActiveConfig. This is a 32-bit unsigned integer used as a bitmask, where each bit controls a specific SIP protection. For example, CSR allow untrusted text controlled whether untrusted kernel extensions can be loaded. CSR allow unrestricted FS controls write access to restricted file system locations. There's also a bit called CSR allow task for PID, which controls whether a process can obtain a task port for another process. Very roughly speaking, a task port is like a process handle on macOS. CSR allow task for PID enforces strong process isolation on macOS. Let me show a quick example of that isolation in action. Here I'm running LLDB as root and trying to attach to the security daemon. But SIP blocks this attach operation. This failure is recorded in the unified log. As you can see here, the logs from Apple Mobile File Integrity say Koh M Apple debug server may not get the task control port of security D. This clearly shows that even root processes cannot attach to other protected processes. This process isolation is crucial. It's a foundation for other macOS security and privacy mechanisms. If that isolation breaks, it opens the door to bypassing TCC, bypassing other SIP protections, and escalating privileges from user to root and more. For instance, if an attacker can run code in the context of another app, they inherit that application permissions. If the hijacked app has TCC bypass permission, the attacker can bypass TCC. Bypassing TCC is just one example. There are lots of other possible exploits if the isolation breaks, as demonstrated in the previous studies. Let me walk you through one example shared by Bojev regular at this year's Nullcon. He discovered that many password managers were vulnerable to dirim injection attacks. The root cause is lack of hardened runtime and the use of special entitlement that disables library validation. He demonstrated that if a password manager is vulnerable to code injection, attackers can easily steal credentials. Here's a concrete example involving Bitwarden, a popular password manager. Bitwarden didn't enable hardened runtime, which means an attacker could inject a dynamic library using the divide insert libraries. Bojev demonstrated that by injecting a diary with keylogging capabilities, an attacker could obtain the master password. So, under what conditions can we debug another process on macOS? To debug a process, you need to obtain its task port, however, which SIP generally blocks. But there are exceptions. For example, during application development, debugging is necessary. So Apple allows it in certain limited cases. Here are the main ones. First, the target process has the Koh M security get task allow entitlement. It can be debugged by another process from the same user. And second, if the target doesn't enable hardened runtime and isn't a platform binary, it can be debugged with root privileges. And third, if the debugger itself has a private entitlement, Koh M system task ports, it can debug any process. Clearly, this last one is extremely powerful, so even LLDB doesn't have this entitlement. If an attacker somehow gains the Koh M system task port read entitlement, they can debug any process. Once they can do that, they essentially have access to any entitlement on the system. This was shown in research by code colorist, who demonstrated that obtaining this entitlement lets attackers bypass SIP's file system protections and even achieve kernel code execution. Because this entitlement was abused, Apple eventually split into multiple flavors. There are now 4 different variants of the system task port entitlement. If a binary has Koh M system task ports controlled, it can call task for PID. If it has Koh M system task port read entitlement, it can only call task read for PID, which allows reading another process memory. There are 2 more flavors with more limited scopes. Apple also reduced the privileges of the system binaries accordingly. For example, USR bin symbols, which was abused in the code colorist research, used to have system task ports entitlement. But now it only has system task ports read entitlement. That means if an attacker finds an injection bug in the symbols binary, they cannot get arbitrary entitlements since it only can read other process memory. But as you'll see later, gaining the task ports read entitlement is extremely powerful. Alright, so let's move on to the actual exploit. Let's start with how I discovered the vulnerability. The story begins with procdump for Mac. For those who don't know, procdump is a Windows system utility that allows you to dump a process memory. It's typically used for debugging. Procdump for Mac is simply the macOS version of this tool. When I first heard about it, I thought, this tool must be useless on macOS. You cannot dump most processes because of SIP. In other words, you'd have to disable SIP to make it work. Or if you have an application built with debug entitlement, you could dump its memory with this tool. But in practice, in general, its use cases are very limited. However, when I tried this tool on macOS Sequoia, I noticed something strange. Even with SIP-enabled Mac, I was able to dump any process. That immediately raised the question, what's going on here? Is SIP process isolation broken? Digging deeper into Procdump for Mac, I found that internally it just executes gcore command. As shown on the slide, it creates a command line string using snprintf, then runs gcore via the popen function. So what exactly is gcore? Gcore is a system utility that generates a core file of a running process. It's a standard utility in BSD-based system, so of course macOS has it too. You give it a process ID and gcore grabs the full memory image and saves it as a macro file. You can then analyze the dump with LLDB. Next, I checked whether gcore has any special entitlement. To my surprise, it does. On macOS Sequoia, gcore has the Koh M system taskports read entitlement. It didn't have this on the previous version of macOS. The moment I saw that, I knew it could be a serious vulnerability. Why? Because having the system taskports read entitlement means gcore can read the memory of any process and save it as a core image, even with SIP enabled. So let me walk you through 3 different ways this can be exploited. The first one is dumping a login keychain. So what is a keychain? It's a central place for securely storing sensitive information, such as certificates, websites, password, secure nodes, and more. You can think of it as a built-in password manager. There are 2 types of keychain, a file-based one, a data protection keychain. The data protection keychain is outside the scope of this research, so I'll focus on the file-based type. File-based keychain use the macOS 10 keychain file format, which is proprietary but has been reverse engineered and documented in various places. On macOS, 2 file-based keychain, the login keychain and system keychain, are created by default. In the wild, malware usually targets the login keychain, so that's where I'll focus. The login keychain is encrypted with the user's login password and contains web service credentials, certificates, and app encryption keys. In the wild, malware, especially InfoStealer, often targets the browser cookie encryption key stored inside. For example, Google Chrome stores its cookie encryption key under the name Chrome Safe Storage. Without obtaining it, an attacker cannot decrypt the contents of Google Chrome browser cookie. Here is a high-level overview of the file-based keychain format and how the login password is used to decrypt the data. Passwords in the file-based keychain are encrypted multiple times with different keys. But the important point to remember is all those different keys come from the 24-byte master key, and the master key comes from the user's login password. Therefore, if we obtain user's login password or master key, we can extract file-based keychain. File-based keychains are attractive targets for attackers. As I mentioned, they contain the cookie encryption key. Stating this and decrypting cookies is a common goal for InfoStealer malware. The usual in the wild technique is to trick the users into entering their password. As you can see on the slide, they display fake password prompt and grab the plain password and then decrypt the cookie encryption key in the keychain. That's the most common approach. The problem is it depends on a suspicious password prompt. So the next question is it the only feasible way to decrypt a keychain? You might think of keylogging as one alternative to grab user's login password. However, on current macOS, stealing the login password via keylogger is difficult. Installing a keylogger requires both root privileges and TCC permission. Also, password input fields created with any secure text field are not logged. Since legitimate password prompt use any secure text field, even a running keylogger would have trouble capturing the plain password. Keylogging from kernel code is also not an option. as macOS now strictly restricts installing third-party kernel extensions. If obtaining the plain password is difficult, what about getting the master key directly? Looking into this, I came across an old article titled Breaking the OS X Keychain by Yuso. He wrote that the security process towards the master key in its process heap. That research was done back in the OS X Lion and Mountain Lion days before SIP introduced. With that SIP, a root process could obtain a task port for any process. Getting the master key is trivial. Today, SIP blocks that. But now, thanks to G-Core's powerful entitlement, we can grab the memory image of any process even with SIP enabled. So the question is, does the master key still exist in security memory on modern macOS? The answer is yes. I dumped security D and found an exact copy of the master key. So the challenge then becomes, how do we locate a 24-byte master key in a multi-gigabyte core image? Based on Yuso's research, I created a heuristic search algorithm for finding the master key. First, I learned the VM map to identify the process memory map and focus on a mark small region. Inside those regions, I search for the 64-bit integer value 24. From there, I follow the subsequent 64-bit pointer and check whether the address falls within the same region. If it does, I add it to the list of master key candidates. This narrows the candidates down to about 10 or 20. For each candidate master key, I check whether it can decrypt the login keychain. Now let's look at a demo of the keychain dumping. In this example, the keychain contains the Chrome safe storage, which is typically targeted by infostealer malware. I will dump this entry without login plain password. First, I will check the keychain's access control list, and only Google Chrome can access this entry. Then, I run the POC script. Now, core file is being dumped. Then the script searches for master key candidate. It tries decrypting the keychain with each candidate. Most fail, but one works. As you can see, the Chrome safe storage entry has been successfully dumped, even with SIP enabled Mac. Next, let's move on to how this vulnerability can be used to bypass TCC. So what is TCC? TCC stands for Transparency, Consent, and Control. It's a macOS privacy mechanism designed to protect user-sensitive data. If you've ever joined a Zoom meeting on macOS, you've probably seen one of those slightly annoying pop-ups for asking for permission. That's TCC in action. But despite being annoying, it's a crucial privacy safeguard. The key point here is that TCC restrictions apply even to the root user. So even if an attack escalates to root, they still need to bypass TCC to access sensitive information. TCC scope has been expanding every year. If you open the privacy and security pane in the system settings, you'll see that many categories of system information are protected, such as contacts and calendars, files, photos, reminders, and more. Process memory in macOS is often full of sensitive data, so dumping process memory can itself be enough to bypass TCC. For example, the Contacts app loads the entire address book into memory, and the Preview app maps a PDF file directly onto memory. PDFs are typically stored in the locations like desktop, documents, or downloads, all of which are TCC protected. That means we can bypass TCC by running an app that handles the sensitive data, dumping it with G-Core, and locating the memory region containing the data. But how do we actually find the sensitive information inside a core image? We can use VMMap again to see which files are mapped to which memory addresses. Once we know the addresses, we parse the macro file and extract the corresponding contents. However, G-Core sometimes fails to generate a core image for certain processes. For example, it fails on Koh M Safari history, which handles Safari browsing history. When this happens, the core file isn't generated at all. But this issue can be bypassed using a hidden D option in G-Core. It's not documented in the man page, but you can find it in Apple's GitHub repository. It says preserve the core file even if there are errors. So even if some memory reads fail, you can still get partial memory dump. With a hidden D option, we can work around G-Core's occasional failures. Now, let's talk about using this vulnerability to decrypt iOS applications. Before diving into the method, let's briefly cover why analyzing iOS apps is tricky. iOS apps are encrypted with fair play, and to perform static or dynamic analysis, you first need to decrypt them. Fair play encryption method is neither documented nor fully reverse engineered. So the most common approach is get a jailbroken iPhone, launch the target iOS application on it, and read the process memory. There are various tools to automate this, but they all depend on the jailbroken iPhone. But here's the problem. Jailbreaking is getting harder. As shown on the slide, the number of jailbreak tools has been dropping. And according to an academic paper by Seldin, most modern jailbreak only works on devices released up to 2017, and those devices will soon stop receiving Apple's update. So fair play decryption that depends on jailbroken devices may become infeasible in the near future. On the flip side, since the introduction of Apple Silicon Macs, we can run iPhone and iPad applications natively on macOS. At first glance, this seems perfect for decrypting them, but there's a catch. SIP enforces process isolation. If SIP is enabled, we cannot dump the other process memory, as I said multiple times. And if SIP is disabled, we cannot run iOS apps on Apple Silicon Macs at all. If you try, you'll get a pop-up saying the app cannot run. So the straightforward approach doesn't work. But now with the vulnerability, we can read any process memory on the SIP-enabled Mac. That means we can decrypt fair play encrypted iOS apps directly on macOS. Here are the steps to decrypt. It's very simple, and run the iOS application on Apple Silicon Mac and find its PID and dump its memory with G-Core and identify the encrypted regions using VM map and replace the encrypted section with the dumped data and patch the header. In this demo, I decrypt the Blue Sky iOS app, then resign it with debug entitlements. Initially, I launch Blue Sky iOS app normally, then try to attach it with LLDB with root privileges. Now, of course, SIP blocks this attach operation, so I cannot attach it. But after running the application and dumping its process memory, I extract the decrypted binary and resign it with debug entitlement. Now the Blue Sky iOS apps is being dumped. Then it is creating a new IPA file. And before installing a new application, I remove the previous one, then install a new Blue Sky iOS app. Since a new application has debug entitlement, I can debug Blue Sky iOS apps directly on Apple Silicon Mac. Now I run the LLDB and attach to Blue Sky iOS app. Yeah, it worked. It's successfully attached to the Blue Sky iOS app. Thank you. Analyzing iOS apps on macOS has big advantages. First, you don't need a jailbroken iPhone. It's especially useful for apps that only support a newer version of iOS, where no jailbreak tools are available. On macOS Sequoia, you can run iOS apps in an environment equivalent to iOS 18. Second, macOS gives you access to frameworks like the Endpoint Security Framework and DTrace, which you cannot use on iOS. This makes it possible to monitor system events, trace execution, and gather insights that would be very difficult or even impossible on real iPhone devices. Now let's touch on how to find similar bugs. This issue was addressed at macOS 15.3. Let's look at the fix. Apple removed the dangerous entitlement from G-Core. As you can see here, system task port read entitlement is now gone. So how do we find bugs like this in the future? One very useful tool is IPSW by Blacktop. It has a diff command that compares entitlements between binaries across different OS versions. For example, here I downloaded firmware for macOS Sequoia and Sonoma, and running IPSW diff command clearly shows that the system task port read entitlement was added to G-Core. This kind of diff makes it easy to spot when a powerful entitlement has been introduced. Finally, let's touch on detecting exploitation attempts. The Endpoint Security Framework provides a getTaskRead event. This event is triggered whenever a process tries to obtain the task read port. To detect an attack, you monitor the getTaskRead event, check if the target process contains the sensitive information, and verify whether the caller of task read for PID is G-Core binary with the system task port read entitlement. If all those conditions are met, there's a high chance this vulnerability is being exploited. So let's wrap up. Today I covered a serious vulnerability that allows reading arbitrary process memory in a SIP-enabled Mac. The root cause was simple but critical mistake, adding an excessively powerful entitlement to G-Core. I've explained that exploiting this vulnerability can lead to dumping the login keychain, bypassing TCC, and decrypting iOS apps on macOS. Here are the key takeaways. Process isolation is fundamental to the macOS security model, and breaking it at the system level leads to severe consequences. And to find zero-day vulnerabilities on macOS, keep a closer eye on entitlement changes. IPSW diff is a great place to start. The Endpoint Security Framework can detect the exploitation attempts by monitoring the getTaskRead event. I've published the POC code full technical details on the GitHub repository. Here's the link, and I'll also show as a QR code. I'll give you a moment to scan it. Okay. So here's a disclaimer. Thank you for listening. My DMs are open on X, so if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me there. Thank you very much.